are in listen-only mode.
Morning, everybody. Hopefully you're all there, and hopefully you can all hear me okay. If we do have any issues with sound, audio, anything like that, then please do just either post a question or type in a chat message, because we are monitoring for that kind of thing. My name's David Rawle from Bytes Security Partnerships. I'm the Technical Director, and I'm here to host and introduce and do the first piece for our webinar this morning, which is insider threats. So deal with internal threats, and as we've put in the title, fighting the enemy within. So today there'll be myself presenting. We've got Dietrich from Varonis, who will follow me, then David Higgins from CyberArk, and then Greg Hewitt from LogRhythm. What they're going to do, hopefully, is cover off in some detail kind of the follow-on areas, if you like, from the introduction. And what I'm going to try and do is set the scene in terms of some of the stuff that we are seeing with our customers at the moment and some of the stuff that's actually happening. Those of you that know me will know that I do a reasonable number of customer meetings and spend quite a lot of time with the sales account managers out on the road doing meetings with people, prospects as well as customers. And we've been seeing some very interesting stuff over the last 3 to 6 months. I apologise for those of you who particularly came to our event at the RAF Club, sort of the second half of last year, because some of this is covering similar ground to that, but the point is still very valid, and it sets the pitch for this webinar very well, I think. So, as I said, let's set the scene. You know, the bottom line is that cybersecurity and the number of threats associated with cybersecurity is just massive, and it's getting bigger all the time. The chances of your users living in a bubble where they don't get exposed to a threat directly on their laptop, PC, tablet is very, very slim. Hopefully, we have all the technology in place and we have all the products in place to make sure that when they are exposed to one of these threats, it is unable to do anything to their machine, that it is able to, the software is able to prevent that malicious code doing anything, and they just wander past it and they never become exposed to it and they're never aware of it. But the reality of it is that the number of threats now and the diversity of threats is so large that the chances, as I put here, tripping over something is going up, and it's going up all of the time. And it is very much the point that as anybody who's responsible for IT security, cyber security within the business, it's not a question of when. It is very much, it is very much a question of when. It is going to happen. It's just a question of what happens to you when it does happen. So, you know, the base question that we ask when we're doing the meetings is, what have you done to prepare for this happening? How are you going to respond to it? And would you even know it was going on? Particularly with something like CryptoLocker, this is a very, very relevant question. Quite a lot of time people only find out when their users log a ticket saying, I can't access X file, and you go and look at it, and it isn't like it's supposed to be. So taking CryptoLocker, I still find it incredible, frankly, and it's grossly oversimplistic, I know, but I find it incredible that a threat that has been around now for so long is still so pervasive in corporate networks. End users just seem to have a habit of finding it. I was with a prospective customer last week that had been hit with it 3 times in the last 6 months, despite taking what they felt were all the steps they needed to do to deal with it. Funnily enough, we've spoken to them about it, and we've also let them speak to some of our reference customers who I know are out there who have had their users trip over it and have not been infected by it, and with a bit of luck they won't be a prospective customer for very long, they'll be an actual customer. But CryptoLocker is a very real example of a morphing threat that has been around for 18 months to 2 years now, that customers are still getting, or businesses rather, are still getting infected by. And the thing about CryptoLocker, it will encrypt everything it can find. It's like, you know, if you ever have a water leak at home, God forbid, that water gets everywhere. That's what CryptoLocker does. It gets everywhere. But at the moment, to be honest, CryptoLocker is relatively easy if you've got a good backup scheme. I say relatively. It's still a pain in the neck for you as business people, but actually it's quite easy to recover from. It's simply a question of finding out which machines it's on, removing it, and restoring the data. I say simply. That might take you, this particular business reckoned they'd lost 10 days of work time in the last 3 months due to it. But at the end of the day, it is an event on your network that has a prescribed start and hopefully a prescribed end. You can understand the window of damage it did and how far it spread, and you can revert it without paying the fine. But what if? What if somebody changed CryptoLocker and just morphed it and modified it so it's not being picked up on a signature basis by your traditional AV vendors and things like that? And what if it simply changed every 3 to a 5 in every spreadsheet, Word document that it could find, completely randomly, every 20th document, every 50th document, every 100th document? What if it only changed every 73rd 3 in those documents that it found to a 5? How on earth would you, A, discover that that was going on, and B, how would you restore that data? If that had been doing that for a month before you found it, you couldn't restore your whole network back to a month ago. That could be business ending for certain businesses. How would you know? And this is where you have to start taking steps beyond just depending on AV and perimeter security to actually deal with this kind of stuff. And you actually have to take steps to do internal work. The other question that has not come up yet, but that we pose, is what happens if CryptoLocker gets morphed to use the ODBC connectors sat there in your admin tools on most of the machines to provide connections to SQL databases to actually do the same thing to fields in SQL databases? Anybody who has write access through Active Directory to a SQL server could find themselves inadvertently corrupting those SQL servers. I mean, it's a horrible concept. And the reality of it is you need to have the piece of the puzzle in place to A, try and stop these things happening as much as it's possible, assuming from the point of view that you can't stop it arriving on the endpoint machine, that you can stop it happening to the data internally, and B, detect it. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And what we're going to talk about today and what the other guys are going to talk about is very much this concept of an ideal world. And as we see it, you can't do everything, but certainly normal Active Directory-based accounts or accounts for any application will never have access to data or applications not essential for a normal day's work. Do you need read-write access to a SQL database? No, you probably only need read-only access. To have write access is what we would refer to as privileged access, which is the second level of authentication that we're talking about in the second line. If somebody changes departments from accounts to marketing, or marketing to HR, or accounts to HR, or HR to accounts, etc., do you have business processes in place to make sure that all of their access rights, permissions, etc., are all cleaned up at the back end, and that user only has access to the data they should have access, etc.? That prevents a whole network being encrypted or areas of network being encrypted, and makes it much easier to recover from an event. As I said, we're assuming here that you can't stop these things arriving on the endpoint, but what we can do is make sure we minimize the damage. Users should only have access to the data or the applications that they need on a day-to-day basis. They shouldn't have access to anything they don't need. Privileged access, if one of these things gets onto, as I said already, a machine that has privileged access to a SQL server or to a file share or something like that, the possible effects are horrendous, and too often businesses are lazy about privileged access. It's much easier for a network administrator who works on the network every day to simply put themselves in the domain admin group and log in once. It's just not viable anymore, whether it comes to logging in via terminal services, whether it comes to VPN access. All of these things should require a second level of authentication beyond the basic access to the network that you need to access your email, print things, and access files. And last but not least, if any of these things start happening, it will obviously be a complete change in the normal behavior of your network, whether it's seeing logon events in the Active Directory, file access events on file servers, failed file access events, write events on file servers, etc., etc., etc. The baseline of activity on your network will fundamentally change if anything happens on an endpoint that is affecting your network. And you should be able to recognize that before a user logs a ticket to say, I can't access this file. Just to give you guys out there an idea, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, but typically when an end user can't access a file, they will normally assume there's something wrong with the network or that they have done something wrong. They will normally assume that it will fix itself. So they might go for lunch and try it again later. It might be the end of the day and they think, do you know what, I've had enough. I'm just going to shut my machine down and go home rather than log this as a ticket to say what's wrong. I actually know one customer where that's exactly what happened. CryptoLocker started encrypting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The users actually started noticing it around 4:30 or 5 o'clock. None of them said anything. They all just went home and didn't flag it till the following morning, by which point it had encrypted 228,000 files on the network from one desktop PC. So you have to have the mechanisms and systems in place to actually be tracking these events. And if you've got these kind of things and this kind of stuff sorted out, then you're certainly moving towards an ideal world, and you're certainly being able to move towards a place where you can say to your board of directors within the business, we have done everything we can to stop these things happening. So that's me. That's the introduction. What I'm going to do is hand over to our speakers to explain how to achieve some of those ideal world things that I've just said. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Dietrich to go next, and I'll be quiet for the next half an hour and 40 minutes and be back on at the end to help with the question session in case you guys have any questions. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll speak to you shortly.
Thanks, David. Now this is Dietrich. I'm just flipping over to my screen. Please bear with me while that happens. Hopefully you guys can see it right about now. Anyways, hopefully you can see it. Can you? David?
Yes, Dietrich, we can, but we can see the whole presenter view, not just the presenter slide, just so you know.
Well, I have duplicated my screen, so guys, you get to see that presenter view then. I won't, I have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to, I won't bother trying to fix technical issues. We did try this out beforehand, everybody, so apologies. Anyways, like I said, we're going to be talking about protecting your data from the inside out, user behavior analytics, insider threats, least privilege in only 10 minutes. This is a bit about me. My name's Dietrich. I work for Varonis with Bytes. That's my contact details. Our blog has fantastic information. If you're into Twitter, that's my Twitter feed. A bit about Varonis. We've been around for over 10 years. We have well over 4,000 customers globally. Over 10% of that number are here in the UK. We help organizations manage and protect their data, very data-centric view from the inside out. Relevant to this talk is how we as an organization started. We were founded by two guys from NetApp. They were techies. They were dealing with a large data project off the coast of Angola for an oil and gas company. They had all this data that was very expensive to acquire, scans of the seabed floor, soil samples, etc. It was on various locations, NetApp filers on ship and on land, and then it wasn't. The data disappeared. Questions were asked. What happened to it? Was it a malicious attack? Did it go to a competitor? Why can we no longer find it? Who had access to it? There was a myriad of questions. They spent a heck of a lot of resources, and about 6 months before they gave up and found out that they really didn't have the answer, and then that's what left us with the opportunity and the idea to start off and answer some of these questions. So this is what I'm going to be talking about, the agenda, all in 10 minutes or less, which you can probably tell by the rapidity of my speech. Talking about insider breaches, the anatomy of them, real-world breaches, the what, why, how of UBA, user behavior analytics, and some case studies. An example again, the data risk assessment. These are the individuals who are involved in an insider breach. They are inside your organization. Some statistics, 86%, I'll refer to this later as well, 86% of all data breaches are internal. They are either someone in your organization who willfully, for fun and profit, is trying to exfiltrate data, find information that's of value to them. The most common is the guy in the middle playing video games. This is inadvertent data exposure. That's quite common as well. We talk about imposters as well, and whether that imposter is somebody who's gained access to your organization's data via phishing, for example, but they're leveraging the permissions that are granted to them via that hacked account. This is the script they act to. This is what the actors do. This anatomy of a breach or a kill chain. They look around, they do some port scanning, they try to get in, they'll do phishing campaigns. Obviously, if they already work for your organization, those first two steps they no longer have to do. They try to find the information that is of value to them. They will go laterally. They will talk about privileged escalation. CyberArk will talk about some in terms of privileged accounts. I'll talk about all accounts privileged escalations. They'll try to obfuscate their tracks and get that data out. As an example, Target, if you remember, they're the large retailer in the States. They were significantly larger since this. They've lost a lot of their market share, and their executive team have all disappeared, and their share price has dropped significantly. But they lost 40 million records. They had a refrigerator contractor who had a username and password on the system. Little did they know that account had access to a point-of-sale system. They went sideways from there. Basically, they took all this data out. Industry experts identified the best what they could have. Oh, by the way, it's worth highlighting, Target, like many other organizations, and perhaps yourself, they had firewalls, next generation firewalls. They had APT. They were worried they were going to be attacked by China. They had IDS. They had IPS. They had DLP. They had Identity Access Management. They had every acronym going, but they still had this breach. What they didn't have was user behavior analytics, understanding the data flows, the relationship between users and the data they were accessing. They weren't reviewing entitlements either. Anyways, that is an example, and this is the focus of this, means the perimeter isn't as relevant as it was before. I'll refer to this statistic later on, but 87% of security spend is done on firewalls. 86% of data breaches are internal. So goodbye secure perimeter. It's incredibly porous. Someone gets inside, they're already inside, you already employ them. You have a lot of information within your organization of which is valuable. They can find it because they have access to it, and they're going to try to get that out. Organizers also realize they've been breached significantly longer than the breach themselves. The average time is 270 days. The average cost of a breach, you can see there, is quite expensive as well. The reason why there's such a long length of time, if you think about things like Snowden and WikiLeaks, how did the NSA find out? He exposed the information. Manning and that was Manning and WikiLeaks. Snowden, I'm thinking of something else, but in both instances, the organizations that were breached only knew once the information was out in the public domain. Sony, if you remember, they produced a movie, I think it was last year. I think Angelina Jolie directed it. Certain members of certain organizations really didn't like the content of the movie, and they thought they were going to attack them, and they did. They did a cracking job. They got into the organization. They found they went sideways. They found a file with username and passwords, happy days. They then used that to leverage other systems and exfiltrate loads of data. It cost a lot of embarrassing time for Sony. This is what that kill chain looks like. They got in, like I said, went through that path of getting that data out. This is what it would have looked like in our solutions, specifically using the threat models which we have. David mentioned AV. AV relies on file signatures. We can look at activity patterns, what the source, what the files, what the activity, what normal looks like, and see the elements in the key chain which may indicate that you've got something untoward going on. So those are the various steps that would have looked at. And this is how we do it. We pull in the information on the file systems, on how people get access to data through Active Directory. We audit all the activity according to everything that we see in terms of Active Directory and the file systems. We can also look in the content. And then not only do we do a lot in terms of showing where users and groups have access, we find out what normal looks like. And if we know what normal looks like, we can see what abnormal looks like and alert against that. More on that later. So what is UBA? Like I mentioned, that it's understanding that relationship between users, how they're accessing data and what they're accessing, where they're accessing it from, the times, the devices, all that sort of stuff. So taking that correlation of the various things to understand normal, what baseline of normal is, and then look at AI to understand what abnormal may look like. So again, some statistics I mentioned before. Everybody, historically and currently still, I think it might be swinging the other way, security investments, 87% on firewalls. And again, 86% data breaches are internal. So you can see that's a bit of an issue. I mentioned the cost to realize and that most industry experts agree that this is a way. If you want to protect against a data breach, then you have to understand who's going to breach that data and how they're accessing that data, users, insider accounts. How we do it, we collect, we create, we analyze that metadata. We discover not only the critical assets, but also the noteworthy people. Talk about phishing campaigns, go for a big fish. Where does the CEO, who are the people who work with the CEO, other executives, M&A, HR, finance, who are these individuals? We can automatically discover those, understand their activity patterns, how others in the organization interact and collaborate with them, and the data that they're utilizing, understanding that normal and abnormal, and talk about the and alert against abnormalities against it. So the quick and immediate value is you're able to detect against these insider threats, the privilege escalations, and abuse. An example, someone reading your executive's email, understanding that relationship between the data and the users, reducing the time. Talk about David's comments about CryptoLocker, which I'll go over in just a second, but greatly reducing the time in which you can identify, react, and recover from these type of breaches. Last point on that slide, specifically for LogRhythm, we can also integrate with systems like LogRhythm and other UBA systems. So this is a great example. We have a customer of ours. They are a large military organization. They had a breach. They didn't know the source of the breach. They didn't know the scale of the breach, i.e. they didn't know what had been breached, but they were aware that they'd been breached. They had, again, the same acronyms in place. They had firewalls. They had next-gen firewalls. They had IDS, IPS, APT, DLP, Identity and Access Management. They had everything in place, and they never were able to understand their breaches. They put our solutions in. Within 6 months, they caught 30 attempts of trying to steal the data. Prior to that, and again, not a single one, and a very layered approach. But before that, they caught none. They also reduced the excessive privileges by over 50%. If people don't have access to data, they can't, they can't breach it. That's again showing what it would look against our threat models. Another thing in terms of CryptoLocker, like David mentioned, this is insiders are the new malware, but also a very prevalent type of malware is, and related to those insiders is CryptoLocker. Other ransomware are available. So again, we're able to understand what that looks like as an activity pattern and alert against it, disable the accounts, cut off the SIF's connection such that it stems the tide of that activity, but also you can restore in very quick time. Again, that's what it would look like within the solutions. Very simple to set up, what those threat models look like. And lastly, if you're interested in this, we have data and risk assessments, giving the ability to understand the state of play of your environment, how complex it is, how open your permissions are, what alerting would look like in your organization, being able to set up some of those alerts, a host of information that you can derive from it. Here's just an example of something you've seen. You have sensitive information. It's open to everyone. You've got information in your environment. It's open to everyone. You can start alerting against that. If you're interested in that, you can talk to Bytes or you can click on that link. And with that, I think I'm within my 10 minutes. Happy days. And I went through only 54 slides. Thanks, guys. I'm kidding, by the way, it's only 24.
That's great. Thanks very much, Dietrich. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. So, we hand over to our next speaker.
Great. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So, quick intro. My name is David Higgins. I'm a Director for Professional Services for CyberArk here in the UK and Ireland region. And, linked to the theme, I really want to talk about the threat of insider, and really obviously specifically kind of from the focus that we've got here at CyberArk, which is all around privileged access and what role that plays. And let me just get these slides moving because it's not moving when I'm clicking. There we go. I just want to start off with this this kind of question, because we talked a lot about perimeter, and I'm very much in agreement with both Dietrich and David about the perimeter is becoming a bit of a fuzzy line, and really is the outsiders are becoming the insiders. But so this question isn't really so much relevant to that. It's just actually an interesting concept when it's linked to privileged access, which is when you purchase a new firewall, what is the first rule on the firewall? Well, the first rule is deny everything, and then we open up what access we want to allow through in the firewall. When it comes to our IT administrators and IT support staff, the same doesn't seem to apply when it comes to their privileged access. It's a case of actually giving them full admin access because it allows them to do what they do and a hell of a lot more. And then at some point try and look to take that access away. And when we look at a lot of the incidents that the previous speakers have talked about, privileged access was a key part of that. Whether that be cyber criminals, hacktivists, state-sponsored attackers, or of course in line with today's conversation and insider breach, they all have different political drivers, all different motives, but they all have the same thing in common. At some point in their attack process, they'll look to get privileged access, because ultimately it's privileged access that's going to allow them to bring systems down, that's going to allow them to access data that would not necessarily be available to them typically. IT administrator that gets full access to a file share or to a server that's running a file share, guess what? They're going to have access to the data. A DBA with access to a database with client information is also going to be exposed to client information, which has zero relevance to his or her role as a DBA administrator. Okay. As per the quote on the slide, in 100% of data breaches, it's stolen credentials that are used. And typically, actually, when we start to talk about the insider breach, it's not so much stolen credentials, but it's the lack of control around privileged credentials that are used. When we talk about privilege, which I'll kind of define in a minute, we're talking about a whole ream of accounts, and we're talking about accounts that are usually unmanaged. So it's not necessarily that these are just stolen, but it could be that actually we're talking about passwords for administrator, for root, for SA accounts, for service accounts that haven't been changed in years, that are set to a memorable password because the operations and the support teams need to know what those passwords are, because there are scenarios that they need to use them. What it also means is that we have a large ream of privileged accounts out there in the infrastructure which aren't being managed properly, which aren't being managed as we do for end user accounts, making sure they change every 30 days, every 60 days. And it's these accounts that attackers are going after, because once they have this kind of privilege, they can get access to where they want to be, to steal information, to leak information, whatever it may be. And so when we look at the kind of security layers that are most commonly thought of within security, and you can see these outlined on the slide, we really see a new security layer being introduced, which is privileged account security. That's looking after the heart of the enterprise. That's looking after those critical assets, because it's those accounts that allow you to get the privileged access you need onto those sensitive systems, onto those critical assets, to ultimately bring them down, to steal the information, etc. And all the breaches that have been talked about so far today, privileged accounts formed a key part of that attack process. So really, what are we talking about when I say privileged accounts? When I first started out in this industry, I think historically people were thinking of root in Unix and administrator in Windows. Those system accounts that come built into every single piece of software and hardware that you purchase. That can't be removed. We need them. They're needed to set up the systems. They're needed by the operations teams to run and maintain and kind of feed and water the systems. But we also create additional accounts, service accounts, application accounts, business application accounts, various other accounts that are created, and even systems maybe that you wouldn't typically think of as having hard-coded or system accounts within them. Industrial control systems, your endpoints, your social media systems that you use, Twitter, LinkedIn. You know, if you have a public profile for your organization, then you have an account in social media, and that is a privileged account, because my view on what a privileged account is, it's not just those godlike accounts. It's any account which has the ability to basically to configure or change one of your operational services, and obviously operational service is a broad view there in terms of what that is. So we're looking at all these different kinds of accounts, and that's exactly what certainly external attackers are doing. When they breach the perimeter, which, as we've talked about, happens very frequently, they look for a privileged account that allows them to move through the infrastructure. And these will be hash credentials in Windows, these will be hard-coded in applications, these will be stored in various locations without the appropriate controls that makes their life easier. The same lack of controls also make the insider's life easier. If the local admin account on every workstation is set to a known memorable password, and that's quite common, by the way, we see that in a lot of organizations, that the same password will be deployed on all the local admin accounts for a workstation, because as a desktop support card, that makes my life easier. If I want to log into a workstation or a laptop, I know what the local admin password is. Great. If it's dropped off the domain, I can quickly go and I can fix a problem. I know what that password is. But so does the rest of my team. So how do we know who was the local administrator on that machine? How do we know it was genuine activity? And if I know the password, where's the control to make sure that I'm getting approved access? Because when you're getting that level of access, when you're becoming God in a system, there should be a genuine reason that you're doing that, right? The guys need that level of access sometimes, but they need it for a genuine reason. They need it to respond to an incident. They need it to fix a problem. They need it to implement the change. But they shouldn't have unvetted access that they can access whenever they want. By knowing the password, by having open access from their position, their terminal, to the critical assets, open network access, that makes their life easier. And there's numerous instances of former employees logging back into an organization because they knew all the VPN accounts, they knew all the existing accounts for various infrastructure, and then wreaking a bit of havoc because they were let go or they were overseen for promotion or pay rise, etc. And that's simply just down to kind of lack of controls around these accounts. So really what we talk about to organizations when we're looking at these highly critical accounts, providing access to your most sensitive systems containing either intellectual property or containing client information, is first of all we need to create a control point. We need to make sure that the operations teams and support teams get the access that they need, but they should only be doing it when they need it. They shouldn't be able just to log in whenever they want, simply because they know the password and they have the open access. So we talk about actually securing those privileged credentials in a digital vault. And obviously I have a physical vault represented in this slide, but securing in a digital vault and making sure that those credentials are rotated as you do for your end users. Human user accounts, we make sure that you have to change your password every 45 days, whatever it may be. You get the reminder in Windows to say, hey, your password is about to expire. Without a privileged account security solution in place, it's rarely done for these most critical accounts. And actually, when you look into your organization, you'll find that you'll have far more privileged accounts than you do human user accounts. And it's quite easy to see why. Say, for example, you're in an organization of 2,000 employees. Each employee is going to be given a workstation or a laptop to work from. Each of those has a built-in admin account. We then need the network to support the communication with those workstations and the various systems. So you talk about routers and switches and firewalls, each of which, every time you purchase it from Cisco or Juniper or Checkpoint, has a built-in admin account. You then got your domain controllers, you've got your application servers, you've got your exchange servers, databases, etc., etc. The list goes on. And every single one of those has built-in privileged account. And then there are additional privileged accounts that are created. So actually, we're typically looking at a scale of 4 times the number of privileged accounts to human user accounts. So it's really important to make sure that these accounts are rotated and managed in the same way that we're doing for the human user accounts. And then as per the middle part of the slide there, implement strong controls. So if, as an IT admin, I need access to a Windows server to perform a patch or restart a service, fine, let me do that, but there should be an approval that allows me to do that. Integration with change management. If I have an approved ticket in, say, ServiceNow or Remedy or some other change management system, let's leverage that. Let's make sure that before the user gets that level of very critical access, that we're validating there's a genuine reason, and the user's not just doing it whenever they want. And those breaches, those big insider breaches like Edward Snowden, etc., they were ultimately caused by the fact that he could access the systems whenever he wanted, and there weren't those controls, and there wasn't that monitoring. The other thing that wasn't in place as well is that isolation. So this is something we talk about a lot as well, is isolating your most critical assets from the targets. The target of any attack, whether it be external attackers coming in, they're going after the workstations. It's the users clicking on the wrong links. It's the users opening the wrong attachments, getting malware deployed on their machine. From the insider risk perspective, it's also that user, they're going to be using their workstation as a point of access into the infrastructure. What we talk about is actually providing an isolation layer, abstracting the critical assets from those front-end machines, from the workstation desktops, removing that direct network access that exists between them, so it makes the external hacker's life a hell of a lot more difficult if they breach a workstation, and they will continue to do so. We isolate where that breach is, we contain that breach. And if it's an insider, again, they can only be getting access to the targeted systems if there's an approved process. Yeah. And once you create a kind of isolation here through essentially kind of a proxy-based approach, you can implement better recording, better monitoring. We actually now start to track what these admin users are doing, because at the moment they've got generic access. They're logging in as a root or administrator or enable in Cisco, and we don't know who they are. By putting them through a control point and monitoring what we're doing, we can get individual accountability. Even if there's 10 users connected at the same time to the same server as root, you can actually have 10 separate sessions to understand what each individual user did. So if something suspicious went on, we can attribute that to one user as opposed to trying to point the finger at 10. And then really my last point, before handing over to the next speaker, is that the previous two recommendations are all about controlling that interaction, putting controls or security controls in place to make sure that there's governance around the approved access, there's monitoring in place, we're doing two-factor authentication before they can get access to a privileged account. But it's also important, especially when we look at the insider, to put some account intelligence, some analytic behavior around each individual user, each individual administrator, to understand what they're doing. So this is something as well that we're doing. So we're individually profiling each privileged user, each administrator, each support staff, each operations staff, to understand what's their typical behavior. Very much as Dietrich was talking, that kind of what's their normal day like. So when they start to deviate from that, and not based on a signature, but when an individual deviates from the typical behavior, they start logging in at weird times. They start accessing systems from strange locations. They start requesting access to a hell of a lot more systems than they typically do. We need to flag that as a potential threat. And if all those are happening at the same time, then the threat level is higher. If we detect users accessing systems directly without going through control point, some circumventing controls, then also we need to flag that. And the privileged account intelligence or privileged threat analytics does exactly that. It's all about analyzing each individual user and spotting where either an insider is acting suspiciously or an internal employee's had their account compromised. And a lot of the breaches, Dietrich talked about this, only one happened from a different location of the world, supposedly. And it's strange to see when we look at these attacks that those outside attackers typically operate during their business day, during their 9 to 5. Which isn't typically the 9 to 5 of the US or the UK. So actually by putting that account intelligence and spotting when access is happening at strange times, it would actually have helped understand when potentially accounts have been compromised for internal employees. When we look at the likes of Ed Snowden, etc., who's suddenly accessing a lot of systems outside of his normal behavior, again, it would have flagged an alert to say, this is something that needs to be looked into. Okay. So that's it from myself. Thank you very much for your time. And I'll hand back to the guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So let's move on with the last session. Hopefully we've managed to hand that over.
Can you hear me okay?
If you do have any questions, yes, we can. As I was just say, guys, everybody out there, if you do have any questions, I don't think we've had any posted yet, but do feel free to post them as we go, and then we can address them at the end. So I will be quiet and hand over to Greg.
Perfect, thank you very much. Good morning, my name's Greg Hewitt. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so telling you how LogRhythm remediate and mitigate against the threats within the organization. Now, for those that don't know, LogRhythm are a security intelligence vendor. Gartner put them in the top right-hand corner of the Magic Quadrant for SIEM, but it doesn't just incorporate SIEM, which is the security information and event management technology. It also combines this with full host network analytics, as well as full file integrity monitoring solution. So what we can deliver is a complete holistic view of breach behavior on your network. Now, we've already heard today about the ever-expanding threat landscape, along with these well-funded attackers creating sophisticated attacks which increases the growing cybercrime economy. However, these incidents are not always in the form of a direct and targeted attack, but it can also include breaches caused by compromised credentials, lost devices, disgruntled employees, inappropriate network usage, incorrect access rights and fraud. And the internal risk to your organization is as big as the external risk. So we're all clear that this isn't going to go away, and we've heard it already today, but it's not if I'm going to be breached, but when I'm going to be breached. And this message is becoming more understood, especially as the growth of security incidents, as you can see, is increasing year on year. The problem's not going to go away, so we have to do something different. We don't have to look far either to find organizations that have suffered. A few have been mentioned today already. But they've all had the same thing in common. They've all had mature security infrastructures in place, and yet they still haven't been able to see or prevent a breach from causing them harm. So a new approach is required. Prevention-centric approaches can stop the common threat, so your security infrastructure is still valid. However, the advanced threats
we need a different approach, and that is the big data analytics that LogRhythm can deliver. So LogRhythm will take that big data analytics piece to identify these advanced threats. Once we've done that, we can qualify and prioritize the detection, so reducing the noise to your security administrator, the guy that's actually looking after the system. LogRhythm will take in a huge amount of data. It can be, termed as noisy, but the skill is in the device to actually reduce that noise to the administrator, find the threat, and do something meaningful with that information. Full incident response, we can even automate some of the responses. So when we see something, we can actually automate and stop it from happening. We'll come into this in more detail later. LogRhythm has the capability to prevent these high-impact breaches and damaging cyber incidents. So by reducing your mean time to detect a breach, you will reduce your mean time to respond, and therefore reduce the risk of a damaging breach from weeks and months. As commonly known, breaches can hide and be in your infrastructure for weeks, down to minutes and hours. So data breaches can be avoided. Advanced threats use all of the exposed network and devices within it, and it can take a long time and therefore make a lot of noise. 86% of all breaches have had the evidence of that breach within the log data. So if you're looking at that log data, analyzing it, looking for weird and abnormal things, which I'll come on to, you can stop it from happening. By early identification and neutralization, we can prevent that breach from causing you harm. So this is how we do it. This is the LogRhythm Security Intelligence Platform. So to reduce your mean time to detect, we collect all event data from a huge amount of sources. As you can see, an example of the vendors that we collect from. Anything that produces a log file, we can bring in. To that, we add log and machine data. So we can bring in syslog information and log information, event log information from all your machines on your network. The more information we bring in, the bigger and clearer picture we can then provide. On top of that, we can add forensic sensor data. So we can add things like network monitor boxes onto the wire itself. So we can look at complete packet flow, what applications are being used, host and destination IP addresses. We can capture the full packet flow. From that, we add user analytics. When we look at the users, we can actually start benchmarking what is normal. So the time and days they log in, their location, what network resources they're using, what common applications they use, areas of the network they visit on a regular basis. We can kind of benchmark all of this. So then if we see anything that is outside of what we class as normal, we can then start alerting on it. We mentioned CryptoLocker earlier. So if a user has been affected with CryptoLocker, the amount of files that user is now accessing through that breach and now being infected with CryptoLocker is way more than what that user would be accessing normally. So that would flag as an abnormal behavior. That user is now going to parts of the network and file stores that it wouldn't normally go to on their normal day-to-day work. So that would also flag as being very abnormal. So as soon as we see that, we can then start, it will create an alert. We can automate the response to that alert, and we can put that user into a quarantine. We can try and start to prevent these things from happening. We can also look at machine analytics. So we can identify what is normal for all your, server infrastructure, server pools, your security infrastructure, network infrastructure. We can see what is normal in terms of usage, packet flow, the processes it's running, the access rights, the connectivity, any deviation at all. You may have a shared server all of a sudden trying to make an outbound connection through your firewall. That is not what your a dumb server just providing information to users should be doing. This is abnormal behavior. If we see it, we can then stop it from happening. So when we correlate the event, log and forensic data, along with the machine analytics and the user activity, we have visibility of threats from both external and internal sources, as and when they happen and in real time. This is the key thing with LogRhythm. By identifying what is normal throughout the network, we can then identify the abnormal events and prevent a major breach from happening. So once an activity has been discovered as a potential threat, we now have to qualify it. The solution provides tools to quickly understand the activity surrounding that threat, to rule it in or out as an actual threat that represents harm to the organization. Once the threat is qualified, therefore we term as discovered, that is your time to detect. You can actually put a physical time frame to that, and the quicker you detect, the quicker you can respond, the quicker you get to mitigate and remediate. Now that the threat is qualified, a fuller understanding of what you're dealing with is now required. So how many hosts were impacted, how many other user accounts have been infected. Let's have a look at the reach within the organization to really understand what impact that threat has had. So LogRhythm will collate all this information into a single case file and present that to the security administrator for further analysis. Then it's time to neutralize, to mitigate against that threat. With the full threat understood, we can now add some countermeasures, and some of these countermeasures can be automated. So things like disabling user accounts, quarantining hosts, changing access control lists, they can all be done by using a feature called Smart Response. Now this works with your workflow as an organization, so we're not asking you to change the way your organization works to use LogRhythm. LogRhythm can work with the workflows of your organization. So if you need multiple signees to change, access rights into the firewall, then we can send out text messages, bring those back in, automate that response by going to the right signatories to get it done. Once the threat is mitigated, it has been responded to, so to speak, the organization can then understand the time it took to respond. So at LogRhythm, we work with the organizations to look at how quickly can you, detect a threat to how quickly you can respond to it, and we try and reduce that down to as much as possible. The quicker you respond, the quicker you mitigate, the quicker that breach has gone away. Then it's time to recover. So while the recovery piece is not sort of critically time-bound, it's obviously a very important piece. And we need to understand how that threat was discovered, how it's qualified, how we mitigated against it, and from this you'll understand how to decrease your mean time to detect and how to decrease your mean time to respond. And as a result, you can make the changes, potentially you'll have to make changes to sort of the IT environment, network changes, patches, even through to things like HR controls over staff, maybe some user training. You identify the key areas that you need to change to prevent this from happening again. So that in a nutshell is how the intelligence platform actually works. You get all of this out of the tin, so to speak. We also have LogRhythm Labs. So in addition to the capabilities of the platform, we have our own analysts working with many threat intelligence organizations to provide you with easily downloaded guides, configurations, reports, so you can tweak your LogRhythm deployment to protect against the latest threats seen in the industry. So as these new threats come about, hit the press, you hear of organizations being attacked with something that's new, you can approach LogRhythm Labs and say, what is the best configuration that I can put in place on my deployment to find that and to stop it? So we're increasing the value to you as a customer and reducing that mean time to detect and to respond. LogRhythm Labs also works with all the compliance, regulatory compliance. So again, as those compliance changes, LogRhythm Labs will tell you how you need to configure your deployment to ensure that you maintain the right level of regulatory compliance. I'll put all these up, but to finish off these last slides, just to show that whilst LogRhythm is the only independent SIEM vendor in the Magic Quadrant and is seen as best of breed, we are continually putting a lot of R&D to keep to keep us at the top of what we do. And as a result, we're kind of winning awards, which is good for you guys to know. That we do what we say we're going to do, and that is to mitigate against those threats within your organisation. So I hope that makes sense. For further information, please contact. We'll work with Bytes, obviously. We can provide web demos and further information for you. So I hope that was of interest. I hope that made sense. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. So, obviously, all of our speakers have chatted through and been through their stuff. We have had just a couple of questions. I don't know if this is something we can then take on with some of the others. So please, anything else that comes up, do ask as we're going along. First question, really, for you, Dietrich. The Varonis data assessment stuff, like the package on it, what does it cover and how is it delivered was the question. I'm not sure if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me, by the way, David?
Yes, can hear you.
Great stuff. So the data risk assessment, by the way, everybody, you'll be getting a link to a sample data assessment. You can go to threat assessments on our site as well. That's another way to find a link to it. But what they cover in terms of how it works, we install within your environment. So just provide a VM. We do a subset of the environment. We pull in the information from Active Directory, understanding, and also overlay that against the information we get from the data sources as well. So, for example, Exchange, SharePoint, file systems, these sort of things. If cloud's also in the remit, we can look at things like Office 365, but give an indication on the state of play of your environment, such as how complex it is, where the permissions are in terms of how, how open they are. So, like I've mentioned in that one slide, most organizations, their permissions are excessive by about 86%. Things like everyone, where everyone has access across that. We'll also understand, we'll run some basic rules. We can be very complex, but usually for the data risk assessment, we'll run some rules like PCI, PII information, where sensitive information exists, however you define sensitive information, understand where that's overexposed. And during that period as well, we'll also set up the rules to do some of the real-time alerting on thresholds and user behavior analytics. So it's a fairly straightforward process. It takes us about 90 minutes if you've got a server, like a VM ready. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, we give you a report. Like I said, I'll send you a sample of that, which outlines the findings.
Fantastic. So hopefully that has answered the question. Thank you very much, Dietrich. We've had another question regarding LogRhythm, Greg, one for you.
Okay.
What systems, really, can you just give us an example of some of the systems you can deliver automated responses via? And just sort of give a couple of examples, if you like. I mean, you talked about one, I think, but if there's just a couple of other examples of things that the automated responses could do.
It can pretty much do whatever you want it to do. So an example could be if you see a user's activity being outside that normal, the automated response could be the fact that that user then is placed into a VLAN. Or is isolated from the network, or is booted off the network completely. Another automated response could be where we've seen a command and control from a server trying to get an outbound connection through the firewall. They're trying to make firewall changes. The automatic response could be just to cut that connection and disable that device completely. But the list is endless in terms of what LogRhythm can do. Automated. We can change the access rights of an individual. We can change, yeah. So
yeah. Okay. Understood. Yeah. Pretty much.
Pretty
much anything is the answer. The limit is your imagination rather than the technology. Pretty much is what we're saying.
Yeah. So it's
cool.
a case of, LogRhythm will work with you to understand, the key drivers and what you would need it to do.
Excellent, cool. Thanks, Greg. One last one that we've got, which is a CyberArk question, so it's kind of convenient. We've got one for each. David, obviously one for you, this one, and it's kind of the classic question, which I'm sure you've got the answer for, and I know that the gentleman who's asked this as well, I know him very well. Obviously, CyberArk sounds absolutely fantastic, but now the CyberArk devices become the single vulnerability and the single point of failure. If you can just explain to the guys what CyberArk do to make sure that the servers are protected from that kind of thing, and we can cover that off, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess there's three answers here. One is an obvious answer around resilience. Obviously, any deployment of CyberArk needs a relevant resilience to cater for, let's say, technical or fault failures. The second link to that is, despite we could put 50 instances around the world in a geographically load balance architecture with HA availability, etc., you're still always going to get complaints or concerns from your end users to say, well, what happens if we lose all 50 data centers? Which, obviously, if you lose 50 data centers, then you probably better stay at home and play golf instead, because not too much to do. But to balance that argument back from the end teams is you always build a break glass process as well, which is stringent controls around how that operates. Then linked to the kind of cybersecurity question of well, if you take all the privileged accounts out of hard-coded locations and make sure they're managed and secured in CyberArk, does CyberArk itself become a target? That's a natural question, totally understandable. But of course, that's one we take very seriously. So the CyberArk Vault that I talked about before is pen tested to an inch of its life on a regular basis. We deploy CyberArk in a very hard and locked down environment, and we try to design it and build it to be the most locked down and secure server that you'll have in your whole architecture. That's the premise of CyberArk. We create that highly secure environment because it's got to do one thing, which is protect the keys to your kingdom. And it's something we've been doing successfully for many years and leveraging that experience. So for any of you who haven't deployed a privileged account security solution, the benefit that you've got with CyberArk is you're following a well-trodden path.
That's fantastic. Thanks for that, David. Well, everybody, I think that conveniently runs out our hour. So thank you very much, all of you, for your attention and logging in today to listen along and to watch along. Thank you very, very much to our presenters, all three of you. Thank you very much for your time. It is greatly appreciated, as always, you giving up the time to do these sessions for us. And we'll be sending out links to the recording of it if any of you want to watch it back, and also associated collateral and anything else we can include, such as the report stuff that was mentioned earlier, alongside the recording link. So thank you very much, all of you, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.